Hey guys, tonight we are going to solve a genuine historical puzzle, gently, as you drift off. It begins with a question that sounds simple, and turns out to be one of the most interesting questions you can ask about the whole human past. Why do some diseases spread and spread until they have killed millions, while others flare up, and burn out, and vanish, and are forgotten? The title of tonight's tale says that the Vikings never got sick. And that, I am afraid, is a myth. It is a wonderful myth, and you will hear it repeated all over the place, this image of the great hardy Norsemen, ruddy and robust and never ill a day in their lives. But it is not true. The Vikings got sick. They got sick a great deal. Their bones, dug up and studied by patient scientists, are marked with tuberculosis and leprosy and infected joints. Their old rubbish pits are full of the eggs of the worms that lived in their guts. They carried an early cousin of smallpox. Their teeth, poor things, were often in a genuinely terrible state. The hardy, healthy Viking who never fell ill is a story we tell ourselves, and the truth is that they suffered from illness like everyone else who has ever lived. So why does the puzzle still stand? Why is it true that the world of the Vikings never saw anything like the catastrophe that struck Europe later, the Black Death, the Great Plague that swept across a whole continent and killed, by some estimates, a third or even half of everyone alive? Both of these things are true at once. The Vikings got sick, and the Viking world never lost millions. And the reason why, when you finally see it, is one of the most quietly illuminating things in all of history, and it has nothing to do with how healthy anyone was, and everything to do with something far stranger and far more interesting. So, before you get comfortable, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always 2 in the morning somewhere. Also, thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are. And if this channel helps you drift off, tap the like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for some sweet background hum and get comfortable, because we have a long and gentle journey ahead of us tonight, back through the long, quiet centuries, to the cold, bright north, to a world of fjords and longships and small farms scattered along the edge of the sea. And let us begin, gently, to take our puzzle apart. Let us begin by laying the myth properly to rest, kindly, because understanding why it is false is the first step toward the truth. The picture in our heads is powerful. The Viking, tall and strong and weathered, striding through a hard, clean northern world, toughened by cold and labor into something almost beyond the reach of ordinary human frailty. And there is a grain of something real in it, because the Viking life was physically demanding, and it did build strong bodies, and a person who survived the dangers of Viking childhood was indeed a fairly robust specimen. But robust is not the same as healthy, and strong is not the same as free from sickness, and the bones tell a very different story from the legend, because we can study them now, the actual remains of the actual people, with a care and precision that would astonish them. And when the scientists examine Viking skeletons, they find the marks of illness everywhere. They find tuberculosis, that slow, patient disease of the lungs and the bones, which leaves its signature on the skeleton and which was clearly present among them. They find leprosy, which we will come back to, because it has a particularly interesting story to tell. They find osteomyelitis, infections deep in the bone, painful and dangerous. They find the worn and ruined joints of arthritis, the price of a lifetime of hard physical labor, in the backs and hands and knees of ordinary Viking farmers who had worked their bodies to the bone, quite literally. And when they study not the bones but the other things that survive, the picture gets richer and, frankly, itchier, because in the old latrine pits, the toilet deposits of the Viking settlements, preserved in the wet ground for 1,000 years, they find the eggs of intestinal worms, in great numbers, whipworm and roundworm and others, the unglamorous parasites that lived inside a great many Viking bellies, passed around by close living and imperfect sanitation, an utterly ordinary and universal fact of their lives that the legends somehow never mention. The heroic Norseman of the sagas, striding the deck of his longship, very probably had worms. Most of them did, and their teeth, oh their teeth. The studies of Viking skulls find tooth decay and gum disease, and teeth worn down and lost, so that many older Vikings were missing a great many teeth, and some were down to just a few by the time they died. There was no dentistry worth the name. A bad tooth was simply endured, or pulled, and the aching mouth was one of the quiet, constant miseries of that world, as it was of most of the human past. So please, let us set the healthy Viking gently aside. He is a story. The real Vikings were tough, yes, and strong, yes, but they were also wormy, and arthritic, and gap-toothed, and marked with tuberculosis and leprosy, and they suffered and sickened, and died of illness, exactly as human beings always have. There was no magic in the north. There was no secret of health hidden in the fjords. And I think it is worth asking, gently, where the myth even comes from. Because myths do not arise from nothing, and this one has real roots. Part of it is simply the way we remember the Vikings at all, through the sagas and the legends, which naturally celebrated the strong and the heroic, and did not dwell on the ordinary aches and illnesses of daily life. Nobody composes an epic poem about a great warrior's toothache. The stories preserved the mighty deeds and quietly forgot the worms and the bad backs. And so the Vikings come down to us pre-selected for robustness. The frail and the sickly among them simply edited out of the tale. And part of it is a deeper wish of our own, I think, a longing we bring to the past rather than one we find there. We want to believe that somewhere, sometime, people lived in a state of natural health, unspoiled, before whatever we imagine went wrong with modern living. We look at our own world of processed food and desk-bound days, and we imagine that the people of the past, living rough and hard and close to nature, must have been healthier than us, must have possessed some robust natural vitality that we have lost. And the Vikings, wild and strong and free in our imagination, are a perfect screen onto which to project that longing. But it is a longing, not a fact, and the bones do not support it. The past was not a lost age of natural health. The past was, for the body, mostly harder and sicker and shorter than the present, and the Vikings, for all their real strength, were no exception. So the myth tells us more about ourselves than about the Vikings, about our own wish for a healthier world somewhere behind us. And the truth, once we let the myth go, is actually kinder and more interesting, because it points us not backward toward an imaginary lost health, but forward toward the real and unprecedented safety that we have actually, genuinely achieved, which no past age ever had. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, and that is the end of our story, not the beginning. And yet, the puzzle remains, sharper than ever now that we have cleared the myth away, because it is genuinely true that this sickly, wormy, tubercular Viking world never suffered a catastrophe on the scale of the great plagues that came later. All these individual illnesses, and never the continent-emptying disaster. How can both things be true at once? That is the real question, and the answer is not about health at all. The answer is about numbers. Let that gap-toothed, worm-ridden, entirely human Viking settle gently in the dark. We turn now to how those people tried to heal themselves, and to the surprising wisdom and the surprising helplessness of Viking medicine. If the Vikings got sick, and they did, then the natural next question is what they did about it, and the answer is a mixture of genuine practical wisdom and complete helplessness, which is more or less the story of all medicine before the modern age. The Vikings had healers, though not doctors in any sense we would recognize. There were no medical schools in the north, no trained physicians, no learned tradition of medicine written down in books. Instead, there were people, often women, who had gathered practical knowledge over a lifetime, who knew the local plants and their uses, who could set a broken bone and tend a wound and ease a fever as well as anyone could in that world, and who passed their knowledge on not through writing, but through doing, from one generation to the next, hand to hand and mouth to ear. And some of what they knew was genuinely effective, which is easy to forget when we imagine the medicine of the past as pure superstition. They used herbs, and some of those herbs really did contain compounds that helped, that eased pain or fought infection, or calmed an upset gut, discovered over long centuries of trial and error and careful observation. There are traces in the record of remedies that we can now recognize as having real value, plants chosen for effects that modern science can actually explain. These were not fools stumbling in the dark. They were sharp, observant people who had learned, the slow, hard way, a great deal about which of the growing things around them could help a suffering body. Think about how that knowledge was even won, because it is quietly heroic when you consider it. There were no laboratories, no way to test a remedy safely, no means of knowing which plant helped and which harmed except by trying them, on real sick people, and watching what happened. Every piece of genuine herbal knowledge the Vikings possessed had been paid for, somewhere back down the generations, by someone trying something and observing the result, passing on what worked and warning against what did not, building up across lifetimes a body of practical wisdom entirely without the tools that make such knowledge safe or certain. It was science of a kind, real careful observation and accumulation, done blind, at great cost, over uncounted years, and the wonder is not that they got so much wrong, but that they got anything right at all. And they did get things right. Real plants, for real ailments, with real effects. A hard-won inheritance of practical healing, gathered painstakingly and handed down. And they were remarkably good at the physical side of healing, at the setting of bones. The skeletons tell us this because they show us fractures, broken arms and legs and ribs that had been set and had healed, sometimes beautifully, the bone knitted back straight and strong. Someone knew how to pull a broken limb straight and bind it so that it would mend. Someone had the skill, and the patient endured the pain of it, and the bone healed clean, and a person who might have been crippled walked again. That is real medicine, real skill, and it saved real Viking lives. But against the great sicknesses, against the tuberculosis in the bones and the leprosy and the fevers that came in the night, they were, in the end, nearly helpless, as everyone was until very recently. They could ease, they could comfort, they could tend and nurse, and try their remedies and pray to their gods. But they could not cure, not really, not the deep infections, and when a serious sickness took hold, they could mostly only watch and hope and care for the sick person as best they could, and grieve if it went the way such things so often went. The wisdom was real, but its limits were hard and close, and beyond those limits lay only endurance and loss. And there is a tenderness in that picture worth holding as you drift. The Viking healer, kneeling by a sick bed in a smoky longhouse in the cold northern night, with her herbs and her bindings and her hard-won knowledge, doing everything a human being could do with the knowledge of that age, which was not much, but was not nothing, and was offered with care. They did what they could for one another. Across all the centuries, that at least has never changed. Let those healers of the North settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the astonishing modern science that lets us read the diseases of the dead in their 1,000-year-old bones. How can we possibly know any of this? How can anyone say, 1,000 years later, that a particular Viking had tuberculosis, or carried smallpox, or was riddled with worms? The answer is one of the quiet marvels of modern science, and it is genuinely wondrous, and a lovely thing to contemplate as you drift, because it means that these long-dead people can still, in a way, speak to us. It begins with the bones themselves, because many diseases leave their signature written into the skeleton, if you know how to read it. A trained scientist can look at a Viking skeleton and see the telltale marks of tuberculosis, the particular way it damages the spine. They can see the changes leprosy makes to the bones of the face and the hands and the feet. They can see the healed and unhealed fractures, the worn joints of arthritis, the pitting and scarring that different sicknesses leave behind. The skeleton is a record, a document written in bone, of much of what a body suffered in life, and it survives, patient and legible, for 1,000 years and more, waiting for someone with the knowledge to read it. And then there are the things around the bones, the whole context of a burial and a settlement. The latrine pits, as we have said, preserving the eggs of ancient worms in the waterlogged ground, so that scientists can literally count and identify the parasites that lived inside people 1,000 years dead. The layers of a settlement, holding the traces of what people ate and how they lived and what afflicted them. An enormous amount can be reconstructed, patiently, from what the ground has kept. But the most astonishing tool of all is the newest, and it still amazes me every time I think about it. Scientists can now recover the actual genetic material of diseases from ancient remains. When a person dies carrying an infection, tiny fragments of the genetic code of the germ that infected them can survive, locked away inside their teeth and bones, for 1,000 years or more. And modern science has learned how to find those fragments, and read them, and reconstruct from them the very identity of the disease. This is how we know, with certainty, that a strain of smallpox was circulating in the Viking world. Scientists found its genetic traces in Viking Age remains, recovered the fragments of the virus's own code from inside ancient teeth, and read them, and there it was, the fingerprint of the disease, preserved across 1,000 years inside the body of the person it had infected. Think about what that means. A Viking died, long ago, carrying a sickness. Their body was buried, and the centuries passed, 1,000 years of them, empires rising and falling, the whole modern world coming into being, and all that time, locked inside their teeth, were the tiny genetic fragments of the very disease they had carried, waiting. And at last, in our own age, someone dug them up, and had the extraordinary knowledge to find those fragments and read them, and so we now know a true and specific thing about a sickness that afflicted a real person 11 centuries ago. The dead, through the patient miracle of science, still testify. Their sufferings are not entirely lost. We can still, if we listen with the right instruments, hear a little of what they endured. And there is something I find genuinely moving in that, a kind of reaching across time, a way in which those forgotten people are not entirely forgotten after all, in which their bodies still have something true to tell us, if we approach them with care and respect, and the patience to learn their language. The bones remember, and we are finally learning how to read what they remember. And it is a strange and tender kind of immortality, when you think about it, that a person who lived and died 1,000 years ago, whose name is utterly lost, whose whole world has vanished, can still, through the patient work of science, tell us something true about themselves, about what they carried and what they suffered. Not their name, not their story, not the things they loved. All of that is gone beyond recovery. But this one true thing, the mark of a sickness in their bones, the fingerprint of a disease in their teeth, survives and speaks and is heard at last, 1,000 years too late to help them, but not too late to matter. Every one of those studied skeletons was once a person as real and as present to themselves as you are to yourself tonight, frightened of their illnesses, hopeful, alive, and a little of that reality reaches us still, across the enormous gulf, carried in the patient bone, and we receive it, and we learn from it, and in the learning we honor, in a small way, a life that would otherwise have left no trace at all. Let that patient testimony of the bones settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the first piece of the real answer to our puzzle. which is hidden in the smallness of their world. Here is the first and most important key to our whole puzzle, and it is so simple that it is easy to miss, and so deep that once you see it, you can never unsee it. The Viking world was made of small places, far apart, and a disease, a certain terrible kind of disease, cannot live in a world like that. Let me explain, gently, because this is the heart of everything tonight. Think about the world the Vikings actually lived in. Scattered farms, small villages, a few trading towns that seemed large to them and would seem like nothing to us. And between all these little pockets of people, enormous distances of empty country, mountain and forest and fjord and open sea, the total number of people was small, and they were spread thin across a vast cold landscape, gathered into little clusters with long, lonely gaps between. Now here is the thing about that, the thing that matters more than anything else tonight. There is a certain kind of disease, the most dangerous kind, the kind that causes the great sweeping epidemics, that needs a constant supply of new people to infect. Think of a disease like measles as an example. When measles infects you, one of two things happens. Either it kills you or you recover, and if you recover, you are then immune, protected for the rest of your life. The disease can never touch you again, which means that from the disease's point of view, every person it meets is used up, infected once, and then either dead or immune, and either way, no longer any use to the disease at all. So a disease like that has a terrible hunger. To keep going, to keep existing at all, it must find fresh people, new people who have never had it, faster than it runs out of them. And that means it needs a very large number of people, living close enough together to pass it along in an unbroken chain, with enough new babies being born, constantly, to supply it with fresh victims as the old ones become immune or die. Scientists who study this have even worked out roughly how many people you need. For a disease like measles to keep itself going, to become a permanent resident of a population, you need a community of hundreds of thousands of people, all connected, all in reach of one another. And the Viking world simply did not have that. It could not offer it. Take Iceland, that great Viking settlement out in the cold Atlantic. At its height in the Viking Age, Iceland held perhaps 10,000 people, perhaps a few times that, scattered around the rim of a large empty island. And the number of people a disease like measles needs to sustain itself is not 10,000 or 30,000. It is hundreds of thousands. Iceland was not even close. It was smaller than the disease needed by a factor of 10 or 20 or more. And so what happened, in a world of small places, was this. A terrible disease might arrive, carried by a traveller, and it might tear through a settlement and cause real suffering. But then it would run out of people. It would infect everyone it could reach, and they would die or recover, and suddenly there would be no one left for it to jump to. No fresh, unexposed person within reach, and the chain would break, and the disease would simply vanish, burn out, disappear, having nowhere left to go. It could flare, but it could not sustain. It could hurt a village, but it could not devour a world, because the world was too small and too scattered to feed it. That is the first great key. The Viking world was too small and too spread out for the worst diseases to take hold and stay. Not because the Vikings were healthy, because there were not enough of them, close enough together, to keep a great plague alive. And I want to linger on this idea for just a moment more, because it is so counterintuitive and so important, and once it truly lands, it changes how you see the whole human past. We naturally assume that a big population is a strong one, that there is safety in numbers, that a large crowded society is more robust than a small scattered one. And in many ways that is true, but in this one crucial way, when it comes to the great epidemic diseases, it is exactly backward. The large crowded society is the vulnerable one, and the small scattered society is the protected one, precisely because the disease needs the crowd to survive. Numbers, which are strength in so many other ways, are weakness here. The crowd, which is safety against so many other dangers, is the very thing that lets the plague live. Scientists have a name for this threshold, the number of people a disease needs to sustain itself, and they call it the critical community size. And it is a genuinely beautiful and slightly chilling idea. Below that size, a disease cannot become permanent. It can visit and hurt, and then it must leave or die out, because it runs out of fresh victims. Above that size, the disease can settle in and stay forever, becoming a permanent resident, a constant presence, always finding new people to infect among the endless supply of newborns. And the number, for the fiercest diseases, is large, hundreds of thousands of people, all connected, all in reach. It is a threshold that divides the whole human past in two, between the small scattered worlds that were below it and safe, and the large connected worlds that were above it and exposed. For almost all of human history, almost everyone lived below that line. The whole long age of scattered farms and small villages and tribal bands, stretching back into the deep past, was an age below the critical threshold, an age in which the great crowd diseases simply could not take permanent hold, because there were nowhere near enough people packed close enough together. And then, slowly, as populations grew and cities rose and the world filled up and connected, more and more of humanity crossed over that line, into the dangerous zone above it, where the great plagues could live. The Vikings lived below the line. Medieval Europe, by the time of the Black Death, had crossed above it. And that crossing, from below the line to above it, is one of the great hidden turning points in the whole story of human health. The moment a society becomes large enough to sustain its own plagues. Let that world of small, scattered places, held safe below the terrible line, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to what the Vikings ate, and to the ways their food both strengthened them and, in the lean times, quietly failed them. Part of the legend of the healthy Viking rests on the idea that they ate a wonderful, wholesome, natural diet, and there is something to that, but the truth, as always, is more mixed and more interesting, and worth a gentle wander as you grow sleepy. The Viking diet, in a good year, was genuinely varied and nourishing. They were farmers and fishers and hunters, and they ate the produce of all three. They had grain, barley mostly, made into bread and porridge, and used to brew ale. They had the meat of their animals, cattle and sheep and pigs and goats, though meat was precious and not eaten every day by ordinary people. They had fish in abundance, especially along the coasts, fresh and dried and preserved, a great reliable source of good nourishment from the cold, rich northern seas. They had milk, and made it into cheese and butter and skyr, the thick soured milk that Icelanders still eat today. They had eggs and wild birds, and the things they could gather, berries and nuts and greens and seaweed. In a good year, on a prosperous farm, a Viking ate well, a diet that a modern nutritionist would look upon with considerable approval. And this good eating did build strong bodies, and it is part of why the survivors of Viking childhood could grow into the powerful people the legends remember. The bones of well-fed Vikings show it, growing tall and strong on that rich mixed diet of meat and fish and milk and grain. But here is the shadow behind the good years, and it is an important one. There were also bad years. The north was a hard and marginal place to farm, on the very edge of where crops would grow at all, and a cold summer, or a failed harvest, or a long cruel winter could mean hunger, real hunger, for a whole community. The food supply was not reliable. It swung between plenty and scarcity, with the turning of the seasons and the mood of the weather. And in the lean times, in the late winter before the new growth came, when the stores ran low, people went hungry, and hunger does terrible things to a body's ability to fight off sickness, because a well-fed body resists disease far better than a starving one. This is one of the deep and cruel connections in the whole history of human health, that hunger and sickness walk together, that a famine is so often followed by a plague, because bodies weakened by lack of food fall easy prey to infections they might otherwise have fought off. And the Viking world, for all its good eating in the good years, lived always close to that edge, and in the hungry times the sickness found its opening, and the two old enemies, hunger and disease, did their work together as they have all through human history. And this connection between hunger and sickness reaches forward into the greatest part of our story too, because it was not absent from the tale of the Black Death itself. The years just before that great plague struck were years of hardship in Europe, of failed harvests and famine, of a population that had grown large and was pressing hard against the limits of what the land could feed, so that many were already hungry, already weakened, already living close to the edge, when the disease arrived. A well-fed and comfortable population might have suffered terribly from the plague in any case, for it was a fierce disease, but a population already worn thin by hunger was all the more vulnerable, all the more easily overwhelmed, and the famine that came before helped prepare the ground for the catastrophe that followed. The two old enemies again, hunger opening the door for disease on the grandest and most terrible scale. So this is a thread that runs through the whole of our story, from the smallest Viking farm to the greatest catastrophe of the medieval world. Hunger and sickness, always together, always feeding one another, the weakened body and the waiting disease. And it is one more thing that the modern world, at its best, has learned to break. For where there is enough food, reliably, for everyone, one of the great old openings for disease is closed, and the body meets its infections from a position of strength rather than weakness. The Vikings never had that security. Almost no one in history ever had it. The reliable abundance we take for granted, the near certainty of enough to eat, is one more of the quiet miracles that stands between us and the hard world of the past. So the Viking diet was not a magic secret of health. It was good when it was good, and it built strong bodies in the years of plenty, and then it faltered in the years of want. And in those faltering years the people paid the price in sickness and death, as people always have, everywhere, whenever the food ran short. There was no secret. There was only the old hard rhythm of plenty and hunger, strength and vulnerability, turning with the seasons under the cold northern sky. Let that food, plentiful and precarious, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to what the Vikings themselves believed about sickness, and to the world of gods and spirits and fate, through which they understood their own suffering. We have talked about what the Vikings suffered and how we know it, but we have not yet asked what they thought was happening to them, and that is worth a gentle wonder, because the way a people explains its own sickness tells you a great deal about how they saw the whole world. The Vikings did not know about germs. Of course they did not. No one did, not for many centuries yet. The idea that disease is caused by tiny living things too small to see, passed from body to body, was utterly unknown to them, as it was to everyone until the modern age. So when sickness came, when a person fell ill for no visible reason, they explained it in the terms their world gave them, and those terms were woven through with gods and spirits and magic and fate. Illness might be sent by the gods or by their displeasure. It might be the work of hostile magic, a curse laid by an enemy. For the Vikings believed in the power of certain people to work harm through spells and runes and ill will. It might be caused by unseen spirits, by the many beings their world was full of, the elves and the wights and the darker things that moved through a world far more crowded with the supernatural than ours. There was even a notion, in some of the old beliefs, of illness as a kind of thing that could be shot into a body, an invisible dart of sickness loosed by some unfriendly being, lodging in the flesh and causing pain and disease. And so their responses to illness mingled the practical and the magical, freely, without any sense of contradiction, because to them there was no contradiction. A healer might apply a genuine herbal remedy, one that really worked, and in the same breath carve a healing rune, or speak a charm, or make an offering to a god. And to the Viking mind, these were all simply different tools for the same job, different ways of reaching for help against the sickness, some working on the body, and some on the unseen forces they believed lay behind it. They used everything they had, the real medicine and the magic together, because they could not tell which was which, having no way to test it, and so they reached for all of it at once. We should not feel superior about this, and I say that gently, because it is easy to smile at the healing runes from our lofty modern vantage. But think about what they were actually doing. They were facing an invisible enemy that they could not see, could not understand, could not defeat, that struck without warning and killed without reason, and they were trying, with everything their culture had given them, to make sense of it and to fight back against it. They reached for explanations because the alternative, that sickness was simply random and meaningless and unstoppable, was unbearable. They wanted the world to make sense, even a hard and frightening world, and so they built the frameworks that let it make sense. Gods and spirits and fate and magic, and within those frameworks they did their best to protect and heal the people they loved. And that impulse to explain the sickness, to fight it with whatever you have, to refuse to simply accept it as meaningless, is the very same impulse that, many centuries later, would build the real science of medicine. It is the same reaching, the same refusal to give up before the invisible enemy, only armed at last with tools that actually work. The Viking carving a healing rune and the modern scientist sequencing a virus are, in a deep sense, doing the same human thing, reaching out against the darkness of disease with the best their age can offer. It is only that we, at last, have found the tools that the Vikings, for all their courage and their trying, never could. Let those old beliefs, those gods and spirits and healing runes, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a genuine surprise, the one way in which the Vikings really were ahead of the medieval Europe that came after, which is that they liked to be clean. Here is a real reversal, one of the few places where the popular picture is not too kind to the Vikings but too cruel, because we imagine them as filthy, wild, unwashed barbarians. And in fact, by the standards of their age, the Vikings were notably, even famously, clean. We actually have evidence for this from the people around them, who noticed and sometimes complained about it in a rather backhanded way. There is a well-known account from medieval England, written after the Vikings had settled there, grumbling that the Norse settlers were altogether too fond of bathing, that they combed their hair and bathed regularly and changed their clothes and generally kept themselves far too well groomed, and that this was giving them an unfair advantage in charming the local women. Imagine that, a complaint that your enemies are too clean, too well kept, too attractive because they wash. That is not a complaint anyone ever made about the medieval knights who came later. And the archaeology backs it up. Viking sites turn up combs, in great numbers, beautiful combs made of bone and antler, carefully crafted and clearly treasured, because the Vikings combed their hair and their beards, and cared about how they looked. They turn up tweezers and ear cleaners and other little tools of personal grooming. The Vikings held a bath, a proper wash, on a regular schedule, at least once a week by many accounts, which does not sound like much to us but was a great deal more than many later Europeans managed. They used steam baths, sweat lodges, hot water. They kept themselves and their clothes and their hair clean, to a degree that genuinely stood out in the medieval world. Now, we should not overstate it. Clean by the standards of the early medieval world is not clean by our standards, and their settlements still had the waste and the animals and the parasites we have already met, and personal grooming does not stop tuberculosis or leprosy. A well-combed Viking with clean hair could still have worms and a mouthful of rotten teeth, and did. Cleanliness of the hair and skin is not the same as the deep sanitation of water supplies and sewage that actually stops the great diseases, and that no one would have for many centuries yet. But still, it is a lovely correction to the myth, and it matters for our story in a small way too, because it reminds us that the Vikings were not the wild, filthy brutes of legend, but careful, self-respecting people who liked to be clean and took real trouble over it. And it sets up, by contrast, one of the quiet tragedies of the later medieval world, which is that as Europe grew richer and more crowded and more advanced in so many ways, its cities also grew filthier and more crowded and more dangerous, until the great crowded medieval city, for all its wealth and sophistication, was in some ways a far more dangerous place to live, disease-wise, than a clean, scattered Viking farm had ever been. Progress, in that one narrow sense, ran backward. The Vikings washed, the great medieval cities, packed and connected, festered, and the disease, when it came, knew exactly what to do with all that crowded closeness. Let that surprising Viking cleanliness settle gently in the dark. We turn now to how that hard society treated its sick, and to a moment of real tenderness recorded in the old sagas. We tend to imagine the Vikings as a hard people, and in many ways they were, living a hard life in a hard land, with a warrior culture that prized strength and courage and could be genuinely brutal. And it would be easy to assume that such a people would simply cast aside their sick and their weak, having no use for them. But the truth, as far as we can tell it, is gentler and more complicated than that, and it is worth a soft moment, because it shows us the human warmth that ran underneath even that hard world. The sagas and the old records give us glimpses of how the sick were treated, and they are not all harsh. We see, in the skeletons, people who lived long lives with serious disabilities, with old injuries that would have left them unable to fully fend for themselves, and who nonetheless survived for years, which means someone was caring for them, feeding them, keeping them alive, when it would have been easier not to. We see the healed bones set with skill and patience. We see, in the stories, moments of real tenderness toward the sick and the dying, alongside the harshness. There is a moment in one of the old sagas, quiet and human, where a man is asked to take his sick kinsman, a leper, aboard a ship, to carry him where he needs to go. And there is reluctance in it, and awkwardness, the natural human flinching from disease that we all know, and yet the obligation is felt. The kinship is honoured. The sick man is not simply abandoned, but remains someone's responsibility, someone's kin, someone to be dealt with and cared for, even in his affliction. It is not a simple picture of pure compassion, but it is not a picture of pure cruelty either. It is something more real than either, the mixed and awkward and genuine way that real people, then as now, tried to do right by their sick, even when it was hard and frightening and inconvenient. Because that flinching and that obligation and the tension between them is deeply familiar, is it not? The care of the sick has never been simple or easy. Illness frightens us. It always has. The instinct to pull back from the diseased body is old and deep and human, and the Vikings felt it as we feel it. And yet, against that instinct there is the other thing, the bond of kinship and love, and shared humanity that says, "This is my person, and I will not abandon them, and I will care for them even though it is hard, even though I am afraid." That struggle between the fear and the love is one of the oldest and most human of all struggles, and the Vikings lived it exactly as we do, and mostly, as far as we can tell, love won often enough. The sick were cared for, the injured were kept alive, the dying were not, mostly, simply cast out. Even in that hard world, people looked after one another as best they could, against their fear, because that is what people do, and there is real comfort in that, threaded through the sadness, and worth carrying towards sleep, that the care of one person for another, the tending of the sick, the refusal to abandon the suffering, is not a modern invention or a luxury of easy times. It is ancient. It is one of the deepest and most constant things about us, present even in the hard, cold warrior world of the Vikings, present in every age, in every place, however difficult. Wherever there have been sick people, there have been other people caring for them, at some cost to themselves, out of love. It is one of the most reliable and beautiful facts about our species, and it was as true in a smoky Viking longhouse 1,000 years ago as it is in a modern hospital tonight. Let that ancient care of the sick settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the wounds of war, and to the surprising skill with which that warrior people mended broken bodies. The Vikings were, among many other things, warriors, and a warrior society produces a particular kind of medical problem, the wound, the injury of battle, and it is worth a gentle look at how they dealt with it, because it shows us both the harshness of their world and the real skill they brought to bear against it. The skeletons of the Vikings show us their violence written in bone. There are sword cuts, and the marks of axes and spears, and the blunt, crushing injuries of the shield wall, where men pressed against men in the press of battle. Some of these wounds were fatal, and the bones show us people who died in fighting, their last moments recorded in the damage to their skeletons 1,000 years on. But here is the striking thing, the thing that tells us so much. A great many of the battle wounds show signs of healing. The bone was cut, or broken, or pierced, and then it mended, which means the person survived. They took a terrible wound in battle, and they lived, and their body healed, which means that someone treated them, and that the treatment worked well enough for them to recover. So the Vikings had real skill in treating wounds, born of grim necessity, because in a society that fought as much as they did, the tending of injuries was a constant and essential art. They knew how to close a wound, how to bind it, how to stop bleeding, how to care for a broken bone so that it healed straight. There are hints in the sagas of the treatment of the wounded after battle, of women often being the ones who tended the injured men, cleaning and binding their wounds, and there is even a famous saga moment where a wound is tested for depth and seriousness in a particular way, by feeding the wounded man a strong-smelling broth, and then smelling the wound to see whether the broth could be detected coming through it, which would mean the gut had been pierced and the wound was mortal. It is a grim and clever piece of field diagnosis, and whether or not that exact method was truly used, it shows a people thinking hard and practically about how to assess and treat the wounds of war. And they had, we think, some things that genuinely helped. Wounds were sometimes treated with substances that we can now recognize as having real antiseptic properties, natural things that really did help to fight infection, discovered by trial and error over long, grim experience. They could not work miracles, and many wounded men surely died of infection despite everything, because without true understanding of germs there was only so much anyone could do. But they saved many, more than we might expect, and the healed wounds in the bones are the proof of it, silent testimony to the skill of the Viking healers who pulled men back from death after battle, again and again, with the hard-won practical knowledge of a people who knew a great deal about wounds, because they saw so very many of them. There is something almost gentle in that hard fact, when you look at it rightly, that even in their most violent moments, even in the aftermath of the battles that were so central to their world, there were hands reaching out to heal, to bind the wound and set the bone and pull the injured man back toward life. The same culture that produced the violence also produced the healing of it, the care that came after the harm, and the healed bones remember the care as much as the wounds remember the violence. Even the Vikings, even in war, mended one another. It is a small warm light in a hard place, and a good one to hold as you drift. Let those healed wounds of war settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the strange and beautiful idea that saved the Vikings without their ever knowing it, the idea of distance itself as a kind of protection. There is something I find genuinely lovely about the truth we just uncovered, and I want to sit with it for a moment, gently, because it turns something we usually think of as a hardship into an unexpected gift. We tend to think of the isolation of the old northern world as purely a difficulty. All that distance, all that empty space, the loneliness of the scattered farm, the long, dangerous journeys between places, the sheer effort of reaching anyone at all across mountain and sea. And it was a difficulty, of course it was. It made life harder in 100 ways. But it was also, without anyone ever knowing it or planning it, a shield. The very emptiness that made their lives hard also kept the worst of the plagues away from their doors, because a plague needs closeness, and closeness was the one thing that world could not easily provide. Every mile of empty forest between two settlements was a mile the disease had to somehow cross, with a living infected person, before their infection burned out. Every stretch of open sea was a barrier. Every lonely farm, tucked away up its own remote valley, was a little fortress of isolation, hard for the sickness to reach, precisely because it was hard for anyone to reach. The distance that isolated them protected them. The emptiness that made them lonely also made them safe. They were shielded, all unknowing, by the sheer vast scale of the quiet land they lived in. And there is a deep and slightly melancholy truth folded into that, which is worth turning over softly as you drift. It is that connection and danger are, very often, the same thing. The things that link us to one another, the roads and the ships and the crowded towns, the closeness and the contact and the gathering together, all the things that make a rich and connected human life possible, are also exactly the things that let a sickness spread. To be connected is to be reachable, and to be reachable is to be reachable by the disease as well as by the friend. And to be isolated is to be lonely, but also, in this one narrow sense, to be safe. The Vikings lived on the safe side of that trade, mostly, without ever choosing to. They had loneliness, and with it, protection. And the world that came later, the busy, crowded, connected medieval world of great cities and long trade roads, would make the opposite trade, gaining all the richness of connection and paying for it, when the plague finally came, in a coin more terrible than they could ever have imagined. But that is later in our story. For now, simply feel the strange gentleness of it, that the empty north, for all its hardship, was in this one way a protected place, wrapped and guarded by its own vast distances, held safe by the very emptiness that made it lonely. And this is not only a fact about the distant past, but a truth that runs right through your own life, if you look for it, and it is a gentle thing to turn over as you grow drowsy. Because the same trade, between connection and safety, between closeness and exposure, is woven through everything, all the way down to the smallest scale. To open your door to the world is to let in both the friend and the infection. To gather with others, to share their company and their warmth and their help, is also to share the air they breathe and whatever it carries. Every human closeness, every gathering, every crowd and every city and every embrace is a small version of the same ancient trade the Vikings and the medieval world made on the grand scale, a trade of some safety for the immense and necessary richness of being close to other people. And we make that trade gladly, all of us, nearly all the time, because the alternative, the perfect safety of perfect isolation, is not really a life at all. The Greenland Norse, at the very edge of the world, had that near-perfect isolation, and it did not save them, it swallowed them. A human being alone is safe from other people's diseases, and starved of everything else that makes existence worth having. We are made for connection, built for it, and we choose it, over and over, accepting its dangers because its gifts are the very substance of a life. The Vikings chose it when they launched their ships, Medieval Europe chose it when it built its cities and its trade roads. And you choose it every day when you open your door and walk out into the shared and dangerous and irreplaceable company of other human beings. So there is no simple lesson here, no tidy conclusion that isolation is good or connection is bad. There is only the deep and gentle truth that they are two sides of one thing, and that being human means living in the tension between them, reaching toward one another across all the risk, because the reaching is what we are for. The Vikings reached, we reach, and the reaching, for all its ancient dangers, is the best thing about us. Let that protecting distance, that shield made of empty space, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the quiet and constant sorrow that shaped every life in that world, the great vulnerability of the very young. There is a hard truth at the center of health in every pre-modern society, the Viking world included, and I will tell it gently, because it is sad, but it is important for understanding what health really meant before our own age, and it is this. The great killer was not the dramatic plague. The great killer, everywhere, always, was childhood. To be born into the Viking world, or the medieval world, or almost any world before the modern one, was to face, in the first few years of life, a genuinely dangerous passage. A great many children did not survive it. The infections that a grown body could fight off could carry away a small one. The hunger of a bad winter fell hardest on the youngest. The ordinary sicknesses of childhood, which we now prevent or cure almost without thinking, were, in that world, a real and constant threat to every small life. And so a significant portion of all the children born simply did not live to grow up. And this was not a rare tragedy but an expected part of life, something every family knew and feared, and far too often endured. This is the thing that lies behind those frightening numbers you sometimes hear, the ones that say people in the past lived only to 30 or 40. Those numbers are averages, and they are dragged down, cruelly, by all the children who died young. A Viking who survived childhood, who made it through that dangerous early passage to adulthood, could actually expect to live a fairly long life, into their 50s or 60s or beyond, a robust and vigorous life by any measure. It was not that everyone dropped dead at 40. It was that so many died as children that the average came out low, while those who survived went on to live full spans. The short medieval lifespan is, in large part, a story about the deaths of the very young. And there is no way to make that anything other than sad, the loss of so many small children, in so many families, across so many centuries. But I want to frame it gently and turn it, at the end, toward the light, because it leads us somewhere hopeful. Because this great ancient sorrow, the death of children, is precisely the thing that the modern world has most triumphantly defeated. The single greatest improvement in human health, the one that has done more than any other to lengthen human lives, is the saving of children who, in any earlier age, would have died. Clean water and vaccines and the understanding of infection and simple medical care have taken that great dark shadow that hung over every cradle in the Viking world and every cradle in history, and have lifted it, almost entirely, from the wealthy parts of the modern world. A child born today, in a place with modern medicine, will almost certainly live to grow up. That sentence would have sounded like a miracle beyond imagining to a Viking mother, or a medieval one, who had buried children and expected to bury more. It is perhaps the greatest gift our age has been given, this near certainty that our children will live, and we hardly ever pause to feel the weight of it, the sheer enormity of that ancient fear finally, mostly, laid to rest. So let that be the gentle turn we take from this sad chapter. The smallest graves of the Viking world, and of all the old world, are a real sorrow, and they should be remembered with tenderness. And they are also the measure of how far we have come, because that particular sorrow, more than almost any other, is one that we have learned to prevent, so that you can lie here tonight in a world where the death of a child has become, at last, a rare and shocking thing, rather than the constant companion of every family, as it was for the Vikings, and for almost everyone who ever lived before us. Let those smallest graves and the great gift of their rarity now settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the ships, and to the strange truth that the very thing that defined the Vikings was also the thing that carried sickness in its hold. And yet the Vikings were not truly isolated, not entirely, and this is where our puzzle deepens and turns, because the one thing everyone knows about the Vikings is the one thing that complicates the whole picture: the ships. The Vikings were sailors, travellers, traders, raiders, who ranged across an astonishing sweep of the world, and everywhere their ships went, they carried more than they knew. Think of the reach of them. From their northern homelands, the Norse voyaged west to Iceland and Greenland, and even, briefly, to the edge of North America. They went south to the coasts of France and Spain, and into the Mediterranean. They went east, deep into the rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine, all the way to the great city of Constantinople and the markets of the Islamic world. They were one of the great connecting forces of their age, threading together distant parts of the world with the wakes of their ships, trading silver and furs and amber, and, it must be said, people, for the Vikings were slavers too, and enslaved human beings were among the cargoes they carried. And here is the thing about a ship, the thing that matters for our story. A ship is a way for a disease to cross the very distances that would otherwise stop it. All that protecting emptiness, all that shielding space, means nothing to a sickness that is sitting in the body of a sailor on a boat, being carried steadily across the water to the next port. The ship leaps the gap. It carries the infection over the sea that should have been a barrier, and delivers it, alive, to a fresh new population of people who have never encountered it before. So the same ships that made the Viking world great, that brought them their wealth and their reach and their extraordinary place in history, were also the channels along which sickness could travel. And we have real evidence of this, genuine traces of it in the record. There is the leprosy, for instance. Scientists studying the spread of leprosy in medieval Europe have found strains of it with links back to Scandinavia, and have suggested that the Viking trade networks may have helped carry that disease along their routes, spread perhaps through the trade in furs, in squirrel skins, which were a real and valuable Viking commodity. The same ships that carried the beautiful soft furs to market may have carried the sickness alongside them, an invisible passenger in the hold, and they carried that early form of smallpox too. We know now, from the astonishing science that can read the genetic traces of disease in thousand-year-old bones, that a strain of the smallpox virus was already circulating in the Viking world, present in the bodies of people from that time and place. The Vikings and their neighbours carried it, suffered from it, and moved it around their world along the paths their ships had opened. So the ships cut both ways, as connection always does. They were the glory of the Viking world and the crack in its shield. They gave the Norse their reach and their riches, and they also gave the diseases a way across the water. But here is the crucial thing, the thing that keeps our puzzle intact even now. Even with the ships, even with all that travel and trade and connection, the world at the other end of the voyages was still, mostly, a world of small and scattered places. The ship could carry the disease across the sea, but when it arrived, it still landed in a world too thinly peopled to let a great plague truly take hold and sustain itself forever. The connection was there, but it was still a thin connection between small places. The full catastrophe needed something more. It needed a world that had grown dense and crowded and knitted together far more tightly than the Vikings ever knew. And that world was still centuries away. And it is worth pausing gently on just how far those ships did reach, because it tells us something about the shape of the Viking world and why, Even at its most connected, it was still not connected enough to doom itself. The Norse trade routes were astonishing for their age. Silver from the Islamic world flowed all the way north into Scandinavia, so much of it that Viking hoards are full of Arabic coins, carried hand to hand along the great river roads of the east. Furs and amber and walrus ivory flowed south and east from the north. Enslaved people, tragically, were carried along these same routes, a dark and central part of the Viking economy that we should not look away from. The Vikings touched Baghdad and Byzantium, the British Isles and the Russian rivers, the coasts of the Mediterranean and the ice of the far north. An extraordinary sprawl of connection for a people we imagine as simple raiders. But look closely at the shape of that connection, and you see why it was not yet enough to carry the full catastrophe. It was a network of thin threads between small nodes. A trading town here, a settlement there. A single ship carrying a handful of people across a great emptiness to another small place far away. The threads were long, and the nodes were tiny, and the whole thing, for all its impressive reach, moved only small numbers of people slowly across vast distances. It was connection, real connection, but sparse, thin, fragile connection. Nothing like the dense, thick, teeming web of the later medieval world with its great cities and its constant heavy traffic. The Viking world was connected the way a few lanterns are connected across a dark landscape, points of light with darkness between. The later world would be connected the way a city is lit, a solid blaze with no darkness left at all. And only that second kind of connection, dense and total, could carry a plague to every corner and feed it enough victims to become the great catastrophe. The Vikings had the first kind. It was not enough, and in this one matter, their insufficiency was their salvation. Let those long ships, carrying their bright cargo and their hidden one, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a single disease, and to the strange soft trade that may have carried it across the medieval world. I want to follow one thread of this all the way through because it is such a strange and vivid example of the whole idea, and it involves one of the loveliest and most surprising of Viking goods, the fur trade, and the disease it may have carried with it, leprosy. Leprosy is one of the oldest and most feared diseases in human history, a slow chronic infection that, over years, can damage the skin and the nerves and the bones, and that carried a terrible weight of fear and shame in the medieval world, so that its sufferers were often cast out, made to live apart, as we have touched on before on other nights. It is caused by a particular bacterium, slow-growing and patient, and it spreads from person to person, though not as easily as the popular fear imagined. Now here is the fascinating part, the part that ties it to our Vikings. Scientists studying the leprosy of the medieval world can do something remarkable. They can look at the specific strains of the bacterium recovered from the bones of its victims and trace their family relationships, their lineages, working out which strain is related to which, and where each one seems to have come from. It is a kind of genetic detective work, following the disease across the map and down the centuries by reading the tiny differences in its code. And when they do this for certain medieval cases, they find something striking. They find strains of leprosy with links back to Scandinavia, to the Viking homelands, turning up in places the Vikings traded and travelled and settled. And this has led to a genuinely fascinating idea, that the Vikings, through their vast trade networks, may have helped spread leprosy across parts of the medieval world, and the suggested vehicle for it is wonderfully specific and strange, the squirrel fur trade. Because squirrel skins, soft and warm and beautiful, were a real and valuable Viking commodity, traded in enormous numbers, and squirrels, it turns out, can carry leprosy, and the handling and trading of infected furs may have been one of the ways the disease travelled, passed from the animal to the people who trapped and traded and wore the skins, and then carried along the trade routes to wherever the furs were sold. I find that image extraordinary and worth turning over gently as you drift. A beautiful soft squirrel fur, a luxury good, prized and traded and worn by someone wealthy far from the cold north where it came from, and traveling with it, invisible, unsuspected, the patient bacterium of one of the most feared diseases in the world. The very trade that connected the medieval world, that carried its wealth and its beauty from land to land, carrying also, in the soft warmth of the furs themselves, the seeds of sickness. The blessing and the danger woven together again, in the same soft bundle, sold in the same market, carried along the same roads. We should be careful not to overstate it, because the science here is still being worked out, and the story of how any disease spreads is always complicated and never comes down to one simple cause. But the general shape of it is real and well-founded. The Viking trade networks did help move diseases around. Their ships and their goods did carry sickness alongside silver and fur and amber. And the leprosy of the medieval world does carry, in some of its strains, the genetic fingerprint of the North, a faint signature of the Viking connection, written into the very code of the disease and readable 1,000 years later by patient scientists learning to trace the paths that sickness took through the connected medieval world. Let those soft furs and their hidden cargo settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a far settlement at the very edge of the Viking world, and to what its lonely story can teach us. There is one Viking settlement whose story is so strange and so moving, and so perfectly suited to our theme, that I have to tell it to you, gently, because it is the ultimate example of a small, isolated world, pushed to the very furthest edge of what was possible, and of what that isolation meant. It is Greenland. Toward the end of the Viking Age, Norse settlers, led according to the sagas by the famous Eric the Red, sailed west past Iceland to the coast of Greenland, an enormous, cold, forbidding land, at the very rim of the habitable world, and there, astonishingly, they built a society and made it last. For nearly 500 years, Norse people lived in Greenland, farming what little could be farmed, raising their animals, building their churches, trading their goods, clinging to life on the very edge of everything, further from the rest of the world than almost any people had ever lived. And Greenland is the purest possible example of the small, isolated world we have been talking about all night. If Iceland was small and isolated, Greenland was smaller and more isolated still, a tiny population of a few thousand people at most, clinging to a couple of settlements on the coast of a vast frozen island, separated from the rest of the world by hundreds of miles of dangerous open sea. It was about as far as you could get from a crowded, connected place. It was isolation taken to its absolute extreme. And for a long time, that isolation did what isolation does. It protected them, in the narrow way we have discussed, from the great sweeping diseases, because no plague could ever reach so small and so distant a place and sustain itself there. But isolation, taken to that extreme, has another face, a harder one, and Greenland shows us that too, because to be that isolated is also to be that alone, that exposed, that utterly dependent on your own small strength, with no help coming if things go wrong. And in the end, the Greenland settlements died. Not, as far as we can tell, from any single dramatic catastrophe, not from a plague, and the science suggests they carried no unusually heavy burden of disease, no worse than any other medieval people. They simply, slowly, over generations, faded away. The climate turned colder, in the long cooling that historians call the Little Ice Age, and the marginal farming grew harder, and the trade ships from Europe came less and less often as the world's attention moved elsewhere, and the little settlements at the edge of the world grew ever more isolated, ever more alone, until at last, sometime in the 15th century, the last of them was gone, and Greenland fell silent, and the Norse world's furthest outpost simply ceased to be. There is a deep sadness in that story, but a quiet and gentle one, the sadness of something slowly ending rather than violently destroyed, and it holds our theme in its most concentrated form. Isolation is protection, and isolation is peril, and they are the same thing seen from two sides. The distance that shields you from the plague is the same distance that leaves you alone when the cold comes and the ships stop and the world forgets you. The Greenland Norse lived on the far side of that trade, at the very extreme of it, protected from the diseases of the crowded world by a distance so vast that it also, in the end, simply swallowed them. To be perfectly safe from the plague is to be perfectly alone, and perfect aloneness, at the edge of the world, is its own slow kind of ending. Let that lost settlement at the edge of the world settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the very furthest the Vikings ever reached, and to a meeting of two worlds that carried, perhaps, a shadow of the great disease story. The Vikings of Greenland did something even more remarkable than settling that frozen coast. From Greenland, they sailed on, further west still, and reached the shores of a whole new continent, the coast of North America, some 500 years before Columbus. And this brief, extraordinary contact holds a quiet place in our story tonight. We know it happened. The sagas tell of it, of voyages to a land they called Vinland, a place of forests and wild grapes and mild weather that seemed like a paradise after the harshness of Greenland. And the archaeology confirms it, because at a place called L'Anse aux Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, the remains of a genuine Norse settlement have been found, the proof that Viking feet really did walk on North American soil 1,000 years ago, that they built houses there, and stayed, at least for a while. But they did not stay long, and they did not spread, and the contact came to nothing lasting, and the reasons why are part of our theme. The sagas tell of meetings with the people already living there, the indigenous peoples of North America, and the meetings did not go well, and there was conflict, and the tiny, far-flung Norse presence, thousands of miles from home at the very end of an impossibly long and fragile supply line, could not sustain itself against the difficulties, and withdrew, and the whole astonishing adventure faded into the sagas and was, for centuries, half believed to be mere legend. And here is the thread that ties it to our story, though gently, because it is a road not taken rather than a thing that happened. When the Vikings met the peoples of North America, two worlds touched that had been separated for many thousands of years, two populations that had been utterly isolated from each other since the deep prehistoric past, each carrying its own diseases, each with no defense against the others. And we know, from the terrible later history, what such a meeting could unleash, when the isolation between the old world and the new was finally, permanently broken centuries afterward, and the diseases of the connected world swept through the peoples of the Americas with catastrophic force, precisely because of the deep principle we have already met, the vulnerability of the long isolated. But with the Vikings, that catastrophe did not happen, or if some small echo of it did, it left no lasting mark, because the contact was so brief, so tiny, so quickly broken off. A handful of Norse, for a handful of years, at a single remote spot, and then gone. The connection was too slight, too fleeting, to carry the full weight of disease across the gap, and the two worlds fell back apart, and remained apart, for another 500 years, until a larger and more permanent contact would finally, tragically, unleash what the Vikings had only just brushed against. There is something to ponder in that, softly, as you drift. How close the great disease story came to beginning, in a small way, half a millennium early, on a forested shore at the edge of everything. And how it did not, because the Viking world, even at its most far-reaching, was still a world of small and fragile connections, of tiny outposts and brief contacts and thin threads across vast distances, not the dense and permanent web that would later bind all the world together and carry the sicknesses to every corner of it. The Vikings reached the farthest shore and touched the new world and drew back, and the great meeting waited for another age and another people and another kind of connection entirely. Let that farthest shore and the meeting that did not quite happen settle gently in the dark. We turn now across those centuries to the world that grew up after the Vikings were gone, and to the great and terrible change that was quietly being prepared. Now we must leave the Vikings for a while and travel forward in time, several hundred years, to see how the world changed, because the answer to the second half of our puzzle, the millions who died, lies in a slow transformation that took centuries and that no one living through it could have understood. The Viking Age faded. The longships stopped coming. The Norse settled down, became Christian, blended into the kingdoms of Europe, and the wild raiding centuries passed into memory and saga. And meanwhile, across Europe, something was happening, slowly, quietly, year by year, that would set the stage for the greatest catastrophe of the medieval world. Europe was filling up, the population grew. For a long stretch of the medieval centuries, the weather was relatively kind, the harvests were relatively good, and the number of people slowly, steadily climbed. More people meant more villages, and villages grew into towns, and towns grew into cities of a size the Viking world had never dreamed of. The empty spaces began to fill in, forests were cleared for farmland, the scattered thin population of the earlier world thickened, gathered, concentrated, until Europe held far more people, living far closer together than it ever had before. And the towns and cities were the crucial thing, because a medieval city was a genuinely crowded place, packed with people living close together in conditions we would find alarming, with poor sanitation, with waste in the streets, with rats and fleas and lice as constant companions, with people and animals and filth all jumbled together in tight quarters behind the city walls. It was, though no one knew it, very nearly a perfect machine for spreading disease. All those bodies, close together, in unsanitary closeness, with new people arriving all the time from the countryside and from other towns. And the cities were connected, far more richly than the Viking world had ever been, by a web of trade and travel that had grown thick and busy over the centuries. Roads ran between them, ships moved constantly along the coasts and rivers, and most importantly of all, the trade routes now reached far beyond Europe, all the way to the east, along the great roads across Asia, connecting Europe to distant lands in an unbroken chain of markets and ports and caravans and ships. The world had been stitched together into one great connected system, far larger and far denser than anything the Vikings knew, a system along which goods and silver and ideas flowed in unprecedented quantities, and along which, one terrible day, something else would flow, because here, at last, was everything a great plague could ever need. Huge numbers of people, far more than the critical threshold, so that a disease need never run out of fresh victims. Crowded cities where infection could leap from body to body with terrible ease. And a dense web of connection reaching all the way across the known world, along which a sickness could travel from its distant birthplace to every corner of Europe, carried on the ships and the roads and the trade routes that were the pride and the engine of the age. The shield of distance that had protected the Viking world was gone, dissolved, filled in by centuries of growth and connection. Europe had built, without knowing it, the perfect conditions for a catastrophe. All that was missing was the spark. Let that crowded, connected, unknowing world settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a deeper and more universal version of our whole idea, and to what happens when a world that has been isolated finally meets the diseases of the wider one. There is a larger and more universal principle hiding inside our Viking story, one that reaches far beyond the Vikings themselves, and it is worth drawing out gently, because it is one of the most important ideas in the whole history of human health, and understanding it casts light on a great deal. The principle is this: when a population has lived in isolation, cut off from the wider world and its diseases, the people of that population never build up any defense against those diseases because they have never met them, and this leaves them terribly, tragically vulnerable if the isolation is ever broken, if the wider world and its sicknesses finally reach them. A disease that the connected world has half learned to live with, that has become a familiar and survivable childhood illness through long exposure, can be utterly devastating to a people who have never encountered it before, whose bodies have no memory of it, no partial defense, no acquired resistance built up over generations of contact. We have seen this, tragically, again and again in human history, most terribly when the isolated peoples of whole continents were suddenly exposed to diseases carried by travelers from connected parts of the world, diseases the travelers themselves largely survived, having grown up with them, but which swept through the isolated populations with catastrophic force precisely because those populations had never had the chance to build up any resistance. It is one of the darkest patterns in all of history, and it flows directly from the same deep logic we have been exploring all night. Isolation protects you, right up until the moment it fails, and then the very isolation that protected you becomes the reason the disease hits you so much harder, because you meet it with no defenses at all. And this casts an interesting light back on our Vikings, and on the whole connected medieval world, because one of the strange, grim mercies of living in a connected world with all its dangers is that constant exposure to disease does slowly build up a kind of collective, partial resistance. The populations of the crowded, connected world were constantly meeting these diseases, and while that meant the diseases were always present, always taking their toll, it also meant that the survivors and their children carried some hard-won, hard-bought resistance, some acquired defense, that a truly isolated population would entirely lack. The connected world paid a constant tax in sickness, but it bought, with that terrible tax, a certain grim familiarity, a partial immunity spread through the population, that made each individual disease a little less catastrophic than it would have been to people meeting it fresh. So the picture is even richer and stranger than we first drew it. Isolation protects you from ever meeting the disease, but leaves you utterly defenseless if you ever do. Connection exposes you to the disease constantly, but slowly builds in you a partial defense against it. And the Vikings and the medieval Europeans lived at different points along that spectrum, and the shape of their exposure, far more than any virtue or strength of their bodies, decided what the diseases could do to them. It was never about being healthy, it was always about the long history of contact, or the lack of it, between a people and the sicknesses of their world. There is something almost philosophical in that, and rather beautiful in its strange way, and gentle enough to rest on. The idea that safety and danger, exposure and protection, are so deeply woven together, so impossible to fully separate, that the very thing that shields you may be the thing that dooms you, and the very thing that endangers you may be the thing that, in the long run, saves you. The world is more subtly balanced than it first appears, and the simple story of strong bodies and weak ones dissolves, on closer inspection, into something far more interesting, a long, slow dance between whole peoples and the invisible living things that share their world. And it teaches a kind of humility too, which is a restful thing to arrive at as the night deepens, because it means that the health or sickness of a whole people is very rarely a matter of their virtue or their failing, of anything they did right or wrong, of any strength or weakness in their character. It is far more often a matter of circumstance, of the shape of the world they happen to be born into, of forces so large and so slow, and so far beyond any individual's control, that no one living through them could even see them, let alone choose them. The Vikings did not earn their protection from the Great Plagues, and the medieval Europeans did not deserve their catastrophe. They simply lived where they lived, in worlds shaped by centuries of slow change that none of them had chosen, and the diseases did what the shape of those worlds allowed. There is no blame in it, and no credit, only the vast impersonal working out of numbers and distances and connections across which ordinary people lived their small brave lives as best they could. And that, strangely, is a comforting thought to rest on, because it lifts a certain weight. So much of the suffering of the past was nobody's fault. It was not a punishment, not a failing, not a judgment on anyone. It was simply the hard working of a world not yet understood, falling upon people who did nothing to deserve it and could do nothing to prevent it. We can grieve for them without blaming them, remember them with tenderness rather than judgment, and feel, across all the centuries, a simple kinship with people who faced the same fears we face, in a world far harder than ours, with far less understanding, and endured. Let that deep and universal pattern settle gently in the dark. We turn now, softly and with great gentleness, to the arrival of the thing that had been waiting, and to the great sadness that came out of the east. Now we come to the heart of the second half of our puzzle, and I am going to tell it gently and briefly, and without dwelling, because it is a very great sadness, and this is a place for rest and not for grief. In the middle of the 14th century, a disease came out of the east. It had lived, most likely, for a long time in the wild rodents of Central Asia, a bacterium carried by fleas, and through some combination of changing climate and the movements of people and animals, it spilled over onto the great trade routes and began to travel west. It moved along the caravan roads and the sea lanes, the same connections that carried silk and spices, and it reached the edge of Europe, and in the year 1347 it arrived, carried by ships, at the ports of the Mediterranean. And then it spread, and here our whole story comes together, because it spread exactly as our puzzle predicts. It found a Europe that was everything the Viking world had not been: crowded, populous, connected, full of dense cities and busy roads and constant trade, full of far more people than any disease could ever exhaust, packed close enough together to pass the infection along in an unbroken chain, and linked by a web of travel that carried it swiftly from port to city to village across the whole continent. Everything that had protected the Vikings was absent. Every condition the plague needed was present, and so it did not flare and burn out, as it would have in the scattered north. It caught, and it held, and it swept onward, unstoppable, across the entire connected world. I will not describe the suffering. You can imagine enough, and imagining is more than sufficient at this hour, and those people deserve to be remembered with quietness, rather than with a catalogue of their pain. It is enough to say that it was, by any measure, one of the greatest catastrophes in the history of our species. Over a few short years, this one disease killed an enormous portion of everyone alive in Europe. The estimates vary, and the true number can never be known, but historians speak of a third of the population, perhaps a half, gone in the space of a few years. Tens of millions of people, whole villages emptied, a continent transformed by loss on a scale that is almost impossible to hold in the mind. And the thing to understand, the thing that ties it back to our Vikings and completes our puzzle, is that this was not because the people of the 14th century were weaker, or less healthy, or more foolish than the Vikings who came before them. It was not a failure of their bodies or their character. It was a consequence of the shape of their world. They died in millions because they lived in a world that was large and crowded and connected, the very things that made their civilization rich and great and advanced. The plague that would have burned out harmlessly in the empty Viking north found, in crowded connected Europe, a perfect and endless field to spread across. Their strength was their vulnerability. Their connection was their doom. The very things that made them more advanced than the Vikings were the very things that let the catastrophe grow so vast. That is the terrible symmetry at the center of our story. The Vikings were protected by their smallness and their distance, the very things that made their world harder and poorer and lonelier. And medieval Europe was devastated by its greatness and its connection, the very things that made its world richer and larger and more advanced. It was never about health. It was always about the shape of the world, and the deep, strange truth that the very things that lift a civilization up can also be the things that lay it low. And you can trace the spread of it, gently, on a map of connection, and see the whole principle written out across a continent. The plague arrived at the great ports first, the busy trading harbours where the ships came in, because that is where the connection was thickest and the ships made landfall. From the ports it moved inland along the trade roads and the rivers, following the paths of commerce, travelling as fast as people travelled, from town to connected town. It reached the great cities and found in them the perfect crowded ground it needed, and burned through them, and moved on along the threads that linked them to the next city and the next. The very map of the plague's spread is a map of medieval connection, a tracing of the roads and the rivers and the sea lanes, because the disease could only go where the connection carried it, and the connection, by then, went almost everywhere. And the few places that were spared, or nearly spared, tell the same story from the other side. The remote places, the isolated valleys, the districts far from the great roads, the islands off the beaten track, these sometimes escaped the worst of it, or were touched only lightly, precisely because they were the last thin, scattered nodes in a world that had otherwise grown dense. They were little pockets of the old Viking-style isolation surviving into the crowded new world, and their isolation protected them, just as it had protected the Norse one final time in the midst of the great connected catastrophe. The pattern held everywhere, in the places that suffered and the places that were spared alike. Connection was the danger. Distance was the shield. It was true in the Viking Age, and it was true in the age of the Black Death. The same deep principle, playing out across the whole of the human world. Let that great sadness settle gently in the dark, and let us hold those millions in a moment of quiet before we move on toward gentler things. We turn now to what the plague left behind, and to the strange and unexpected ways the world changed after it had passed. After the Great Dying, there was a silence over Europe, and out of that silence, slowly, the world remade itself, and some of the changes were strange, and some were even, in the long and painful way of history, steps towards something better. And it is worth spending a gentle moment here, because it lifts our story up out of the darkness a little, toward the quieter ground where we can rest. When so many people had died, the world that remained was deeply altered, and one of the first things that changed was the value of an ordinary working person. Before the plague, Europe had been crowded, and labour had been cheap, and the poor had been many and easily replaced, and their lives had been correspondingly hard, and their bargaining power almost nothing. After the plague, suddenly, there were far fewer people to do all the work that needed doing. The fields still needed tending, the animals still needed keeping, and there were simply not enough hands. And so, for the ordinary surviving peasant, something shifted. Their labour was suddenly precious, because it was scarce. They could ask for better wages, and get them. They could leave a hard master and find a better one, because everyone was short of workers and someone would take them. The old rigid bonds that had tied peasants to particular lands and particular lords began, slowly, to loosen and strain, because the whole arrangement had depended on there being too many people and too little work. And now that was reversed. The survivors of the catastrophe found themselves, without ever intending it, in a stronger position than their parents had ever known. Historians who study those grim years have found something else too, something quietly hopeful hidden in the bones, that in the generations after the plague, people were, by some measures, actually healthier and longer lived than before. Partly this was a hard and sorrowful thing, the plague having taken the weakest and left the strongest, but partly it was something better, that the survivors simply had more. More food because there was more land and fewer mouths, more meat in their diet, better standards of living, spread more widely because the terrible scarcity of people had, by a bitter arithmetic, eased the scarcity of everything else. Out of the great loss came, for those who lived, a fuller and often a longer life. I do not want to draw too bright a lesson from so dark an event, because the suffering was real and immense, and no amount of later benefit can justify or outweigh it. But there is something in the resilience of it that is worth carrying gently towards sleep, that even after the very worst that could happen, the world did not end. Life went on. The survivors rebuilt and remade their world, and in some ways made it fairer and freer than it had been before. And the long human story continued, changed and scarred but unbroken, into the centuries that followed. Human beings are astonishingly hard to extinguish. We endure, we carry on. Even after the great sadness, the fields were sown again, and the children were born again, and the world, patient and green and enduring, healed. And it is worth remembering, gently, that the same great disease touched far more of the world than Europe alone, because the connected web of the 14th century reached across much of the known world, and the plague travelled its whole length. It struck the lands to the east where it had begun, and the great cities of the Middle East and North Africa, wherever the trade roads and the sea lanes carried it. It was not only a European sorrow, but a sorrow of much of the connected world, one of the first truly vast catastrophes of the age of long-distance connection, falling upon everyone the trade routes touched. And everywhere it fell, the same terrible arithmetic applied, and the same resilience answered it. And everywhere, afterward, the survivors picked up their lives and carried on, because that is what people do, in every land and every age, after even the worst has passed. There is a kind of quiet solidarity in that thought, across all the distances and all the differences, that the peoples of that whole connected world shared, at the same terrible moment, the same grief and the same endurance, and the same slow recovery. They were bound together by the disease, as they had been bound together by the trade that carried it, all of them facing the same darkness, and all of them, in their different places and their different ways, surviving it, rebuilding, going on. The connection that had carried the sickness also made them, in their suffering, a kind of single human community, sharing one catastrophe across half a world, and answering it, everywhere, with the same stubborn refusal to be extinguished. Let that slow healing settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the long shadow the plague left behind, the way it returned, again and again, for centuries, and how the world slowly learned to meet it. There is one more thing to understand about the Black Death before we leave it, and it is important, though I will keep it gentle, and it is this. The Great Plague of the 14th century was not a single event that came once and was gone. It was the beginning of something that lasted for centuries. The plague came back. After that first terrible wave, the disease did not simply vanish. It settled into the world and returned again and again, wave after wave, generation after generation, for something like 300 years. Not always as devastating as the first time, but returning, a recurring visitor, a shadow that hung over European life for centuries, striking a city here and a region there, ebbing and flowing, never quite gone. Whole generations lived their entire lives knowing that the plague might come again at any time, as their parents and grandparents had known it, a permanent feature of the world they were born into. And that long, grim familiarity terrible as it was, slowly changed how people responded. And here we find the first faint stirrings of something hopeful, the very beginnings of the long climb toward the safety we enjoy tonight. Because over those centuries of recurring plague, people began, slowly, gropingly, without understanding the true cause, to work out things that actually helped. They noticed that the plague seemed to travel with people, with ships, with trade. And so they invented, out of that observation, one of the first great tools of public health, the quarantine. The very word comes from this time, from the practice in certain ports of making arriving ships wait, in isolation, before anyone could come ashore, to see whether sickness broke out among them. 40 days was the period settled on in some places, and the Italian word for 40 gives us the word quarantine. They did not know about germs, but they had noticed that isolation and waiting could break the chain of infection, and they built that observation into a practice that genuinely saved lives, and that we still use, in its essence, today. They developed other measures too, over those long plague centuries, boards of health in the cities, attempts to control the movement of people during outbreaks, efforts to clean the streets, to manage the sick, to bury the dead safely. It was all done in ignorance of the true cause, all groping in the dark, and much of it was useless or worse, based on wrong ideas about poisoned air and imbalanced humours. But some of it worked, genuinely worked, because they were careful observers even without the underlying knowledge, and they noticed what helped, even when they could not say why. And this is the beginning of the road that leads all the way to us, to our own safe age. The long, hard centuries of living with the recurring plague slowly taught the connected world the first lessons of how to fight back, how to break the chains of infection, how to protect a population, lessons learned at a terrible cost, over many generations, and built up patiently into the beginnings of public health. The people who suffered those recurring plagues were, without knowing it, the first students in a school that would eventually teach humanity how to defeat the great diseases entirely. They paid the tuition in blood and grief, and they began to learn, and the learning did not stop, and it led, century by century, to the watchful safety that surrounds you now. Let that long shadow, and the first lessons learned within it, settle gently in the dark. We turn now back to the deep idea at the center of all this, and to what it can teach us, softly, about our own world. Let us draw the threads together now, because underneath our whole story tonight there has been a single deep idea, quietly running through all of it, and I want to give it to you whole before we turn towards sleep, because it is one of the most illuminating ideas in all of history, and a strangely peaceful one to rest on. The idea is this: disease is not simply a matter of individual bodies being strong or weak. The great epidemics, the ones that change history, are a matter of the shape of a whole society, of how many people there are, and how close together they live, and how richly they are connected to one another and to the wider world. A disease is like a fire, and a society is like a landscape that the fire moves through. A few scattered trees, far apart, and a fire cannot spread. It burns one tree and finds no other within reach and goes out. But a dense forest, all the trees packed close together, and one spark can become an inferno that consumes everything. The Vikings lived in a landscape of scattered trees. Their world was too thin, too empty, too disconnected for the fire of a great plague to spread. Individual trees burned. Individual people, individual villages, suffered their tuberculosis and their leprosy and their local outbreaks. But the fire could never become an inferno because there was too much empty space between the trees. And medieval Europe, by the 14th century, had grown into a dense forest, crowded, connected, packed close, every part in reach of every other part. And so when the spark came, it did not stay a small fire, it became the inferno. the very richness of the forest, the very abundance of it, the closeness and connection that made it a forest at all rather than a scattering of lonely trees, was exactly what let the fire consume it. And here is why this is such a deep and useful idea, and not merely a historical curiosity, because it means that the great vulnerability to plague is not a sign of weakness or backwardness at all. It is very nearly the opposite. It is a consequence of success, of growth, of connection, of the building of cities and the weaving of trade, and all the achievements that lift a people up from scattered survival into rich and connected civilization. The more advanced and connected and populous a society becomes, the more it gains in wealth and knowledge and possibility, and the more, in this one particular way, it also has to lose. Connection is a blessing and a danger woven together into the same thread, and you cannot easily have the one without the other. The Vikings were poor and scattered and lonely, and, in this one narrow way, protected. Medieval Europe was rich and connected and crowded, and, in this one narrow way, terribly exposed. Neither was healthier than the other. They simply lived in differently shaped worlds, and the shape of the world, far more than the strength of the body, decided what a disease could do. And I want to draw out one more turn of this idea, because it is the one that reaches all the way to us, and it is worth holding clearly. The very same forces that we have been describing, the growth of population, the building of cities, the weaving of trade across vast distances, are the forces that we normally call progress. They are the story of civilization itself, the long climb from scattered bands of people scraping a living to great connected societies of enormous wealth and knowledge and possibility. Everything we admire about advanced human society, its cities, its commerce, its arts, its accumulation of knowledge, its sheer teeming abundance of people and ideas, depends on exactly the density and connection that also, as a hidden cost, opened the door to the great plagues. The plague was not the opposite of civilization. The plague was, in a terrible sense, a side effect of it, an unwanted passenger that rode in on the very same forces that built everything good. That is a hard and subtle truth, and it does not mean that progress is bad, or that we should wish ourselves back into scattered isolation, because the scattered, isolated life had its own terrible costs. The loneliness, the fragility, the vulnerability to famine, the slow swallowing of the Greenland Norse. It means rather something gentler and wiser, that every way of living has its costs as well as its gifts, that there is no perfectly safe way to be human, that the very things that protect us in one way expose us in another, and that wisdom lies not in seeking some impossible perfect safety, but in understanding the trade we are making and managing it as well as we can. The Vikings made one trade unknowing. Medieval Europe made another unknowing. And we, at last, are the first people who can actually see the trade we are making, and choose and guard against its dangers with open eyes. Let that deep pattern, that image of the scattered trees and the dense forest, settle gently in the dark. We turn now, at the very last, to our own world and to the quiet comfort of how much we have learned. And now, at the end of our long, gentle journey through the centuries, let us come home, to our own time, and find in all of this a genuine and deep comfort to carry down into sleep, because there is one, and it is real, and you have earned it by staying with me through the sad parts, because we live, now, in the most connected world that has ever existed, vastly more connected than medieval Europe, more crowded, more densely woven together than the Vikings could have imagined in their wildest sagas. By the logic of our whole story tonight, that should make us more vulnerable than any people who have ever lived. A dense forest, beyond anything history has ever seen, waiting for a spark. And in one sense that is true, and we have felt the truth of it in our own recent years. when a new sickness travelled the whole connected world with terrible speed, along exactly the routes our story would predict. Connection still carries danger. That has not changed, and it never will. But something else has changed, something enormous, something the Vikings and the medieval world never had. And it is the reason you can lie safe in your bed tonight, in a way that no one in this whole long story ever could. We understand. We finally, after all these centuries, understand what is actually happening. The Vikings did not know what made them sick. The people of the 14th century, facing the greatest catastrophe of their age, had no idea what the plague even was, thought it a punishment, a poison in the air, the movement of the stars, anything but the truth. They fought it blind, because they could not see the enemy, could not even imagine it, the tiny living things too small to see that were the real cause of all their grief. And we can see it. We know about germs, about bacteria and viruses, about how disease spreads from person to person, about the invisible mechanisms that were utterly hidden from every generation before our own. We have medicines that can cure infections that killed the Vikings where they lay. We have vaccines that can teach the body to defeat a disease before it ever takes hold, so that the great killers of the past, the smallpox that the Vikings carried, the terrors that emptied medieval villages, have been tamed, some of them driven from the earth entirely. We have clean water and sanitation, and the simple miraculous knowledge that washing your hands can save your life. We have public health, whole systems of watchful care devoted to catching an outbreak before it can grow, to breaking the chains of infection, to protecting the many. We are still a dense forest, but now, for the first time in the whole human story, the forest understands fire. It can see the spark coming, it can clear the fire breaks and douse the first flames, and protect itself in 1,000 ways that no earlier people ever could. We are not invulnerable, and we never will be, and connection will always carry its ancient danger. But we are no longer blind, and that changes everything. Think of the sheer distance we have travelled, from the Viking healer with her herbs and her healing runes, doing her brave, helpless best against an enemy she could not see, to the modern world that can read the genetic code of a virus in a matter of days, track a new disease across the globe in real time, and design a defense against it faster than any earlier age could even have imagined. Everything that was hidden from the Vikings is visible to us. The invisible living things that caused all their grief, that they could only explain with gods and spirits, we can see under our microscopes, name, understand, and defeat. The great darkness that hung over all of human history, the mystery of why people sickened and died, has been, in its essentials, solved. We know. After all those hundreds of thousands of years of not knowing, we finally, actually know. And the knowing has brought us things that would seem like pure magic to every generation that came before. A child with an infection that would have killed a Viking where they lay can now be cured, completely, in a few days, with a medicine that costs almost nothing. Diseases that emptied medieval villages have been driven from the earth entirely, so that no living person will ever suffer them again. The water that comes from the tap is clean, free of the invisible dangers that lurked in every drink our ancestors ever took. The simple act of washing hands, which no one understood for the whole of human history, quietly saves more lives than all the heroic medicine of the past combined. We swim in a sea of protection so complete and so constant that we have forgotten they are there, forgotten that they were ever absent, forgotten what it was to live, as every earlier human being lived, in the blind and dangerous world before the knowing. And that forgetting is itself a kind of luxury, the deepest luxury of all, the luxury of not having to think about the thing that terrified every previous generation. The Viking mother, the medieval mother, lived with a fear we can barely comprehend, the constant nearness of sickness and death, especially for their children, a shadow over every day. And you get to lie here tonight almost entirely free of that fear, so free of it that you never even notice its absence, which is the surest sign of how completely it has been lifted. That freedom was not always ours. It was won, slowly, painfully, over centuries, by all the suffering and all the patient learning of all the generations who came before, and handed to you as a gift without your ever having to ask. And that is the true and quiet comfort at the end of our story, that you live in the safest time there has ever been to be a human being, that the diseases which filled the Viking bones and emptied the medieval villages are, so many of them, understood now, and defeated or held at bay by knowledge those poor people never had. That the long hard climb from the blind suffering of the past to the watchful safety of the present is one of the very greatest things our species has ever done, and it is done, and you are living in its result, warm and safe and cared for, in ways your ancestors could only have dreamed of. Let that hard-won safety, that great gift of understanding, settle gently in the dark. We turn now, softly, away from all of it, toward nothing at all but your own rest. There is nothing more to solve tonight. The puzzle is answered, the threads all drawn together, and you can let the whole long story grow quiet now, and dim, and drift away into the warm dark. It was a good puzzle, was it not? And a strange one, that began with a myth and ended somewhere far deeper and far more interesting than the myth had promised. We started with the idea of the healthy Viking who never fell ill, and we found that it was not true at all, that the Vikings sickened and suffered like everyone. And then, instead of a story about strong bodies, we found a story about the shape of the world, about smallness and distance and connection, about the deep hidden pattern that decides what a disease can do. We found that the very things that protected the Vikings were the things that made their world hard and lonely, and the very things that doomed medieval Europe were the things that made its world great. And we found, at the end, that we live on the far side of all of it, in the first age that truly understands, protected as no people ever were before. That is a far better answer than the myth, and a truer one, and a kinder one to fall asleep on. Let the Vikings go now, at last, with their longships and their worms and their gap-toothed grins, sailing off quietly across the cold, bright sea of 1,000 years ago, into their long and well-earned rest. Let the scattered farms and the small, quiet settlements go, wrapped safe in their shields of distance, into rest. Let the crowded medieval cities go, and the great sadness that swept through them, and the millions who lived and suffered and died and deserved their peace, into rest at last. Let all of it, all those people, all those centuries, all that hardship and connection and loss and slow healing, settle down into the deep quiet of the past, where it is finished now, and safe and still, and come home, all the way home, to here and now and this, to your own bed, in your own room, in the safest time there has ever been. No plague is coming for you tonight. No sickness waits in the dark that watchful people are not already guarding against. You are held not only by your blankets and your walls, but by centuries of hard-won knowledge, by all the understanding that all those suffering generations slowly, painfully bought for you so that you could lie here, tonight, and simply rest, safe in a way they never were. Think of them all, for one last gentle moment, all the people of our story, and let them rest too. The Viking farmer with his aching back and his worn teeth, who worked his hard land under the cold, bright sky, and did not know why the sickness came, but faced it with courage anyway. The healer in the smoky longhouse, kneeling by a sickbed with her herbs and her runes, doing her helpless, loving best. The settlers at the edge of the world, in Iceland and Greenland, and on that far forested shore, so brave, so alone, wrapped in the distances that protected them and finally swallowed them, and all the countless people of the crowded medieval world who lived through the great sadness and did not understand it, who buried so many and grieved so deeply and rebuilt patiently afterward, and carried the human story forward through its darkest passage into the light that was, though they could never have known it, slowly coming. They are all at rest now, every one of them, their hardships over, their fears stilled, their long-ago lives complete. And they gave us, without knowing it, the world we live in, each generation learning a little more, suffering and observing and passing on what they had learned, until at last the darkness lifted and the knowing came, and the great old enemy was, so largely, defeated. We stand on all of their shoulders. Every safe and healthy day we live is a gift from all of them, from their endurance and their grief and their patient, slow accumulation of understanding across the centuries. And the least we can do, and perhaps the most, is to live that safety gratefully and to rest easy in it, knowing what it cost and who paid for it. Let your body grow heavy now, and still. Let the last of the day's weight sink out of your shoulders, out of your hands, out of your legs, down into the soft and holding dark. Let your breath move slow and low and easy, all on its own, asking nothing of you. There is nothing to guard against tonight, nothing to fear, nothing to solve or carry or hold, and no puzzle left unanswered, and no old sadness that has not long since faded into peace. The great questions are answered, the old sadnesses are long since healed, and the world, for all its ancient dangers, has never in all its long history known how to care for you as well as it does right now, in this one quiet, safe moment, at the end of your ordinary day. No plague is coming. No sickness waits that watchful hands are not already turning back. The long, dark age of not knowing is over, and you were born on the safe side of it, into the light, and you can rest in that light now, completely, and let the whole long story go. You are safe tonight and every night. You are well, you are held and warm and cared for by more than you will ever know. Sleep now, safe in the light that all those long-ago people helped to kindle, though they never saw it themselves. Good night, traveller. Rest easy. Sleep deep. I'll be here, somewhere in the quiet, when you wake.